Muito bom dia.
Very good morning. Allow me to bid you a warm welcome to this second day of our Creative Europe conference within the scope of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union, Council of Ministers rather, and it is a pleasure for us to launch the second day of our proceedings with a panel devoted to mobility and sustainability challenges ahead for the performing arts. The moderator will be Vania Rodrigues. She is a cultural manager and a researcher. If you please.
Bom dia a todos. Começo por agradecer à Direção-Geral das Artes.
Very good morning, and allow me to thank DG Arts for the kind invitation. I was able to count on the help of several colleagues in preparing the moderation of this panel, particularly because they rose to the challenge of cooperating between themselves, working in network. This short panel has been broken down into 3 segments, and for the very first we've invited 2 European initiatives, European Theatre Convention and Perform Europe, amongst so many who've been committing to these topics so as to have them share with us their thought processes. We'll first listen to European Theatre Convention, a huge formal network congregating mainly public theatres and which has been around for over 20 years. We'll have with us Heidi Wiley, its executive director, and Serge Rangoni, arts director of the Liège Theatre and chair of the network. Heidi and Serge, thank you very much for being with us, and we are looking forward to listening to you.
I'm Heidi Wiley, as Vanya said, and I'm Executive Director of the European Theatre Convention. This is a European network for public theatres, and thanks to the investment and funding we receive from the Creative Europe program, our organization is able to accomplish many of our ambitious goals, such as driving and leading the urgent transition of our sector's sustainable development. So thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. I found it highly inspirational yesterday to hear from the audiovisual sector how greening their industry moves steadily forward. Only half a year ago, we organized as part of the new European Theatre Initiative of the European Commission, and with the support of the German EU presidency, our first ever joint sectorial dialogue meeting, the European Theatre Forum. Sustainability was one of the 3 main themes. So I want to say thank you to the Portuguese EU presidency to continue focusing on theatre and performing arts, and that we can continue addressing these important challenges on EU level. This morning, I'm here with Serge Rangoni, the artistic director of Théâtre de Liège in Belgium and ETC's president, and we'll be talking about the big trends we need to keep our eyes on that will directly impact all of our theatre's activities. But now let me start in pointing out a contradiction. Ecological, sustainable development and mobility in theatre and performing arts are per se in opposition. On the one side, we have to reduce our carbon footprint to combat the climate crisis. And on the other side, mobility increases carbon footprint. But without mobility and of theatrical and performative works, artists and ideas, there is no expansion of thought. There's restriction of the circulation and freedom of speech. So we are challenged to find a way out of this dilemma. Right, Serge?
Certainly, Heidi. Mobility is, in fact, an essential element in the development of the theatre sector, even if there are differences between the 2 modes of working in the theatres in Europe. On the one hand, you have ensemble theatres, and on the other hand, production theatres. That means theatres for the ensemble theatres who have an ensemble of actors and a repertoire, and theatres who are productions houses. They are companies, actresses, actors, directors for each new productions, which are supposed to tour and to be co-produced. Now, depending on the theatre structure, mobility has a different amount of climate impact. Yet for both systems, we can distinguish three types of mobility that are essential for our work. First, national and international touring and co-producing of performances as a business model and important socle of intercultural exchange. Secondly, the mobility of audiences to attend live performances. And an example, in our members, the Stadthausspiel Dresden revealed that mobility is the major cause for its carbon footprint, amounting to 40%. The theater is an ensemble theater, not based on the co-production and touring model, and therefore not traveling so much. This means, and this might be a surprise to some of you, most of this 40% is caused by the theater's audiences simply attending the performance. And this is something that can never be reduced to zero. It needs to be offset, and therefore it's necessary to develop compensation concept and also programs to share this topic with the audience. Third thing, we see mobility in cultural tourism. For instance, the summer festivals all around Europe, beyond borders, also an important part of intercultural exchange.
Well, those figures give us a first indication of where we stand in relation to our carbon footprint. But what does this mean for our artistic work, for our public mission to offer the widest possible audiences the best and diverse European theatre? I imagine every one of you joining this conference has an idea of what this means. But let's take a look inside the theatre, where we met beforehand with our Portuguese colleague, Tiago Rodrigues, the artistic director of the National Theatre Teatro Dona Maria Due in Lisbon. Film up, please.
Hello, I'm Tiago Rodrigues. I work here at the National Theatre, Teatro Nacional Dona Maria II in Lisbon, in Portugal. And we're just a couple of hours away from opening Bajazet by Frank Castorf, a performance that we've been waiting for in Portugal for a long time. Unfortunately, because of the pandemics, we had to postpone it, but finally, after a lot of effort, this great international performance is now being presented in Lisbon and offered to the Portuguese audience. And also, we're a couple of days away from traveling to Avignon, where we will be rehearsing La Cerisée, the Cherry Orchard by Chekhov, which will be one of the performances at the Cour d'Honneur, this year's edition of Festival d'Avignon. And in this turmoil of getting back to traveling, I can't hope but share with you some thoughts of how important it is to make a strong bet in Europe and mobility of artists and international cooperation. I think the risk of closure of cultures, of borders, as a consequence of the pandemics is a very serious risk that would affect highly, strongly, the ability and the richness of the performing arts and culture in Europe. So I think that Creative Europe as a program, the European Theatre Initiative or the European Theatre Forum are bets on a future where we have to rebuild ties between countries and peoples and artists and institutions and aesthetics and ideas and circulation of people and ideas as an idea of Europe where values and ideas and creativity is at the basis of the dialogue and the understanding between people. So I think this is a moment of rebuilding, but also a very important moment of reinventing, of rethinking how can we achieve mobility and how can we get back on track with an idea of Europe, of free circulation of people and ideas and arts, but also do so in a way that we're doing the transition towards a sustainable development, towards fighting the climate crisis. How can we do it in a more ecologically fair, but also socially fair way? And I think this is one of the main concerns of houses like this house, of houses from other countries, big or small independent companies. There has been great discussion about how to recuperate from the crisis that inevitably will follow the pandemics, but doing so reinventing our ways of traveling, of producing, of creating, so that culture in Europe can also be a sort of lighthouse showing the path towards a sustainable transition and development. So this is what I wanted to share with you in a moment where getting back to rebuild the ties between international institutions of culture and artists and workers of culture and the arts seems to me a great challenge and a great ambition for a more hopeful and more fair Europe.
Yes, Jago just said it. I think the pandemic really accelerated our reflection, the change process towards a greener, more sustainable, conscious and mindful, just future in each of all our organizations at different levels. In ETC, we coordinated exchanges between our European partners and developed a visionary program to become by 2030 a climate neutral network of theaters and to steer this progress. We know this is ambitious, but feasible. Yet our challenges go much beyond mobility. Mobility is the iceberg of what needs to change. Much more is relevant and not always visible. And if we want to succeed as a European cultural community, moving fast forward together is crucial. Last week, we published the ETC Sustainable Action Code for Theatres, committing to adapt our environments and actions in the 3 areas towards sustainable processes in theatre organizations, sustainable theatre buildings, and sustainable theatre productions. To achieve these action areas, we are pursuing 8 goals ranging from a dedicated sustainability strategy to training, integrating green stories into our artistic visions, and producing fair collaboration and touring models. But one thing is clear: one can't do this on our own. We need European support, mobilization and coordination with the member states, structural financial aid, policy regulations, knowledge and expertise for sustainable development in the cultural field is almost non-existent yet in the various European states, apart from a very few national agencies in very few countries, and that only recently. We first need to establish a recognized CO2 calculator for our sector, adapted to our needs. Only very few venues have done this yet as well. We need to have the necessary human resources. Just to give you an idea, so far in ETC's network of over 40 theatres in 25 countries, only 2 venues have 1 full-time position of an ecological advisor. A 3rd one was announced in the beginning of this week. So you see, the incentive role of Europe is really essential. This is not just a project that the cultural sector can carry out of its own means to create art. This is a global project, and it needs to be carried with the means of the environment and economic ministries and their respective budgets, all in coordination across Europe.
The change process in our sector is really complex and requires resources that are all the more difficult to find as all resources are mobilized for the recovery of activities in this time. Expertise, often external, is essential to adapt our sector. The digitization increased by the pandemic will partially help us to reduce our travel, to maintaining relationships between people. To give you another example, I can show you here, you can see on the screen how many things are interconnected areas in the work we did in Théâtre de Liège to start the change process. It's a huge work, and when you try to find the resources for this between the ministry, it's extremely complicated. To sum up, it's absolutely wonderful to know that Creative Europe remains a major funding program for Europe's cultural field, with an increased budget to help our sector to rebuild after the crisis. That there is a desire to develop new artistic visions and narratives to create sustainable and desirable imaginations of our future. But it's not enough, as we have seen. If you want to sustain our sector, to continue working with a European dimension and use our artistic power as lighthouse effect for others to follow. To tackle the challenges ahead, we ask the European Commission.
Firstly, to support our ecological transition process so that our sector is part of the sustainability goals the EU approved. This includes all activities, from measuring, understanding, reducing, and offsetting our ecological footprint through information, mobilization, and legislation on European level.
Secondly, to support the sustainability of a sector, it's essential to provide massive support mechanisms for young generations of artists by promoting their access to the European labor markets.
And thirdly, the development of cultural relations with the other continents came to a halt with the pandemic. It's really urgent that we regain the capacity to develop new collaborations with our close neighbors in Africa and with the Asian countries, to maintain a balance or recreate a balanced global North-South equality. And finally, we are really convinced that a place like the next European Theatre Forum can help to accelerate the transformation process by exchanging our know-how and working hand in hand with policymakers for a greener and more just theatre and performing arts sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, Heidi e Serge.
Thank you very much, Heidi and Serge. That was very, very clear. We now pan over to Perform Europe, which is a recent initiative that brings together a significant number of performing arts organizations and networks. It's a sort of a pilot scheme to test the model that is more sustainable and more inclusive, and they've just launched, or they've just announced a dedicated platform with calls open to professionals. And so I think we're all clearly very enthusiastic and are waiting eagerly for the results of the work being done, the research work. We now have with us our Richard Sotir, Secretary General of IETM and Chair of Perform Europe, and Elena Polvitseva, Head of Policy and Research at IETM and Project Manager of Perform Europe. Ausa and Elena.
Immediately.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Portuguese presidency for the invitations to speak here today. And we are here to tell you about Perform Europe. Mandated by the European Commission, IETM, the International Network for Contemporary Performing Arts, is leading Perform Europe, a collaboration with 3 other networks, the European Festival Association, the European Dance House Network, and Circostrata, and our research partner, IRTI Consult. We are now 6 months into the project, and in these 6 months, we have done extensive research into the needs and gaps of the whole performing arts, theater, dance, circus, all the different performing arts that we have in Europe, in the Creative Europe region. We have hosted various events with stakeholders, and we have surveyed and interviewed across the board with a large number of participants. And on the basis of this extensive research, we have just 3 days ago opened up for applications for makers and presenters of performing arts to test innovative ways to do cross-border collaboration. An important part of what our colleagues at ETC were just calling for. Because this is what Perform Europe is about. It is about to explore and test innovative, sustainable practices to show and present work to people and places on physical locations as well as in the digital realm throughout the 40 countries covered by Creative Europe and the UK. We are asking the performing arts sector to reimagine how we can do international touring. We are seeking to find exemplary proposals from presenters and producers of work which have sustainability at heart, green elements, solidarity, shared new economic solutions, which have inclusivity at heart, to truly include those that have not been at the forefront of our sector, and seek ways to strike a balanced representation geographically, from the point of view of the periphery versus the center, from the point of view of showing the strengths of the different corners and colors of the European performing arts. And now my colleague Elena will tell you more about our aims and values and the Perform Europe research.
Thank you, Aude, and good morning, everyone. I want to second Aude and also our colleagues from ETC. At Perform Europe, we are also convinced that cross-border touring and presentation is absolutely vital, both for artistic communities and also for audiences. For us, for citizens, seeing and experiencing artwork from other countries and contexts is important because it develops our empathy and broadens our perspectives and ultimately helps us to understand the diversity and complexity of the world around us. And for artists and presenters, touring and presentation across borders is important because it helps them to renew their artistic practices and develop their artistic approaches. Art will not blossom ultimately if there are no cross-border exchanges and collaborations. But for these values to be fulfilled, we need a sustainable framework for touring and presentation to happen. At Perform Europe, we understand sustainability a little bit wider than just environmental dimension. We understand it as a complex of interconnected elements: environmental, economic, social, artistic, and human sustainability. Indeed, if we only try to tackle climate change and environmental transition as such, we will very soon realize that we also need to take into account social dynamics, artistic values, limits of human capacities, etc. So what do we mean by this sustainable context, sustainable framework for touring and presentation across borders? As Aude said, we conducted a research, and this research helped us to map the needs of the Perform Europe performing arts sector and also their visions in regard to what this sustainable framework can mean. And there are important elements to share. First of all, there is a huge motivation and need to practice fair models and approaches to collaboration in the sector, not only in cross-border touring, but across the whole value chain. Secondly, there is an urge to open up to those who are currently not part of artistic communities, and also to those who are not part of audiences of the performing arts. Thirdly, there is a need for time and space to develop models of meaningful mobility and also meaningful production and distribution. And meaningful, we mean the ones that create long-term, profound links between projects, between people, between places, cultures, skills, and all this is necessary in order to make our ecosystem more sustainable. And the fifth element is, of course, about environmental sustainability. Environmental sustainability is growing in this sector, but at different paces in the European Union. Let's face it, in different countries, in different member states, there is different level of awareness and capacities to tackle the climate change. And also this growing awareness triggered the debate about inequalities and privileges. The sixth and a very important element is about the artistic value. Artistic value remains a core, and it's important that our sustainable framework does everything possible to make sure that artistic value continues to flourish. And finally, to do things in a sustainable way, we, of course, and the art community at large need new skills, new expertise, access to continuous development, and also not to forget, very importantly, this all should happen in decent working and living conditions. So this is the desired state. This is the dream picture. But what about the reality? Our research at Perform Europe helped us to reveal that actually current systems of cross-border mobilities are rather different from that, are rather unsustainable. First of all, touring and distribution of performing arts across borders is not accessible to everyone. There are massive discrepancies, imbalances across geographies, across levels of privilege, across stages of careers, etc. Secondly, in the recent decades, budgets for culture and especially for cross-border collaborations have been decreasing, and this augmented the economic pressure on the artistic community. It led to fragmentation of resources and to an accelerated system of collaborations, which ultimately is quite exhausting for the sector, and it's not always taken into account the artistic interests and values. And also human drain, unfair conditions. Those are all signals that something needs to change in our system. So basically, we identified some important gaps in the resources that we need to create a sustainable framework. And those gaps are, some of them are obvious, some of them less obvious. The gaps are the money, infrastructure, the time, skills and awareness, knowledge, inclusivity, and also gaps in visibility, connectedness for some of the performance professionals, and also lack of equity and equality. There are also very important geographic disparities about which I already shortly said. Our research helped us to map the flows from where performing arts works travel and to where in the 41 countries of Creative Europe plus the UK. So we have also, with the help of 41 national experts, mapped all the existing programs and schemes that support touring and presentation in this region, and also the digital tools that support these processes. So have a look at this graph. Let me just share my screen, and normally it should work. Have a look at this graph. Make sure you see the beginning and the end. So basically our survey contained a question to all the producers and artists. In which countries have you performed at least once? Have you shown your work at least once? We received answers from more than 1,000 artists and representatives of companies. And basically the result you can see on this graph. The countries in which performances were performed the most are Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, Belgium, and so on. And you can also see the end of the graph. Basically, 3 out of 5 respondents to the survey presented their work in Germany as an example. And as another example, only 1 out of 50 respondents performed at least once in Armenia or Moldova. So we also mapped, as I said, and analyzed more than 500 different mobility schemes, touring and presentation schemes and support programs which exist in these 41 countries. And have a look at the next graph. Here the quantitative representation of how those schemes are distributed across the 41 countries. You can see which countries are leading in this sense, and you would see in which country the situation is quite different. Basically, more than 50% of all support programs and schemes are concentrated in Western and Northern Europe. But of course, these figures should be contextualized in regard to the size of the population of countries and also size of the performing arts sector. We have also mapped all the existing digital tools that support presentation and distribution of the performing arts in 41 countries. Here we can especially see the huge gap that exists between the beginning of the graph and the end. The situation is more or less similar to the one that I presented just before. And finally, we have also undertaken a qualitative analysis of all those schemes and programs that exist. And we can see that, yet again, in Western and Northern Europe, there are, we can say, enough opportunities for international touring for artists, and there are also enough opportunities, let's say there are a wide range of opportunities for the presentation of works, while situation in Balkans and Eastern Partnership in Tunisia is quite different from that. Here I stop sharing my screen and I go to the conclusion that we did know about those gaps. It's no news, but probably we didn't see that those gaps were that considerable and that big. And they're all grounds to assume that the COVID-19 pandemic will make these gaps even bigger. It's needless to say that these disparities are not good for the cultural diversity of Europe, because cultural diversity is not just about being different and scattered across a continent. It's about having a framework to collaborate, to interact, to know about each other, to understand each other, and to appreciate the differences and try to build these common grounds. So at Perform Europe, we do believe that the next step is to try to address those gaps. And I give the word back to Auza, who will tell you a bit more about that.
Thank you, Lena. Our hope is that Perform Europe funding scheme will be an important contribution towards addressing the gaps Elena has just described to you. We even dream as far that it might make a small but important contribution towards how funding schemes in general supporting the arts might be shaped in the future. There are ideas, there are lots of innovative ideas out there on how to make sustainable change. We have to open up to these ideas and shape our schemes in such a way to encourage this needed change. Regarding Perform Europe, we're talking about a tangible paradigm shift that requires rethinking of cross-border presentation. And this rethinking and eventual restructuring can only be done on a transnational level, because restructuring in isolation, country by country, will not lead to the desired change. We need a systematic, coordinated support framework that takes into account the complexities and disparities Elena has just described to you. A framework which has an inherent incentive for stakeholders to seek viable, sustainable, innovative methods and practices. Innovative practices which can spill over to other parts of the system and ultimately lead to the desired system change. At Perform Europe, we have just entered the testing phase. As we told you, now performing arts professionals, presenters of work and producers of work alike can fill the Perform Europe digital platform with their innovative visions and wishes to contribute towards this change. We have high hope that Perform Europe experience will contribute towards a sharp vision for a new, flexible, inclusive support framework on a European level, as well as influence regional and national funding schemes on how we indeed do cross-border collaboration. The open call is out. I really encourage you to go on www.performeurope.eu and check it out. And over to you, Vanya. Thank you very much.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Elsa and Elena. Thank you for clarifying some of the disparities we already knew existed. And that helps us transition to the next segment of our program. We're launching the Creative Europe program, and so we have to hear, of course, from structures like the ETC and the IETM. We wanted to hear your ambitions and your plans, but I also felt it was fundamental to consider all this against the backdrop of what artists and cultural professionals think. We shouldn't filter their concerns. And so We're now going to hear from 6 people. 6 people could be 600 people. We're going to hear their voices. And I'm going to thank these 6 people for accepting my invitation to reflect on such complex issues such as these. As I said, there are only 6 of them. Some work in Lisbon, some work in Oporto, others in the Azores. Some have applied to Creative Europe projects and actually been successful. Others have never even applied for anything. 6 people, of course, don't represent anything at all except themselves, but it is just a small sample of the diversity of voices, preoccupations that we don't always hear in fora such as these, but which we shouldn't forget when we launch such decisive programs such as this one, Creative Europe. So let's hear them, let's see them.
No início era simples, o Visões Úteis tinha uma taxa de carbono. Basicamente, pagávamos a uma organização ambiental para plantar por nós as árvores necessárias para absorver o carbono que tínhamos libertado com a criação e a produção artística no ano anterior. Era bonito, era simples, mas era desincorporado. Ninguém percebia, nem mesmo na equipa artística, o que é que estava a acontecer. O que é que fizemos então? Resolvemos vir até aqui e passamos nós a plantar as nossas próprias árvores. Passou tudo a ser muito mais físico, muito mais incorporado, muito mais presente e consciente, porque a serra tem um solo muito duro, cheio de pedras, e estava a cabo das mãos, estava a cabo das costas, mas toda a gente ficou a perceber o que acontecia. E aliviou muito a consciência. Aliviou muito a consciência, mas também não adiantou grande coisa, porque ao longo do ano as árvores iam desaparecendo, porque nós não podíamos acompanhar as árvores. Então percebemos que esta ideia de estar a tentar compensar não era suficiente e tínhamos mesmo que começar a reduzir. Foi por isso que fizemos um plano mais ou menos até ao fim da década, para primeiro começar a consumir energia verde no local dos ensaios, privilegiar fornecedores locais e depois começar a cortar, basicamente, cortar nas viagens, não é? Cortar nas viagens por terra, sobretudo nas viagens de avião, para tentar daqui, se calhar no final da década, conseguir criar sem ter uma pegada a carbono, pelo menos uma pegada a carbono relevante. Nós achamos que não há nenhuma razão para excluir a arte e as indústrias criativas deste esforço global de redução das emissões, mas porque tudo isto, este longo prazo, nos fazia confusão, decidimos experimentar já este ano. E estamos neste momento a criar e produzir um espetáculo que não vai ter pegada a carbono. Isto implica que a equipa artística tenha que vir a pé, de bicicleta ou de metro para os ensaios e no final implica perceber como é que circula o espetáculo. Porquê? Porque a nossa carrinha está mesmo no fim de vida e é uma carrinha a diesel. Como é que nós saímos daqui? O que é que devemos fazer? Devemos comprar um veículo elétrico? Claro que não temos dinheiro. Devemos trocar isto por um outro veículo usado, também a diesel. O que é melhor? Como é que a Direção-Geral das Artes nos pode ajudar a perceber o que fazer e mesmo ajudar a financiar esta transição energética? Vamos ter que reequacionar tudo, as rotas da circulação, as pessoas que circulam, aquilo que temos que levar para circular. Porque esta ecologia também não pode ser só ambiental, também tem que ser uma ecologia social. Como é que nós nos vamos responsabilizar pelas gerações mais novas que chegam agora ao mercado de trabalho? Como é que não vamos trocar a segurança social deles, os nossos descontos para a segurança social deles, por um maior orçamento de cenografia? E as gerações mais velhas, como é que nós vamos aproveitar o potencial das gerações mais velhas que foram financiadas, têm uma vida de criação? Como é que nós vamos dar dignidade à entrada e à saída do mercado de trabalho?
Nós dedicamos-nos à criação artística, à criação de espetáculos. E esse é um terreno, por excelência, ligado ao desperdício. Não há criação artística sem desperdício. Nas longas horas de ensaios são desperdiçados recursos materiais, ideias, recursos humanos.
Tempo.
É impossível criar sem esta lógica de experimentação. Estamos a trabalhar num próximo projeto que se chama O Estado do Mundo, que será um espetáculo que refletirá sobre a questão das alterações climáticas e que nos tem desafiado muito a pensar como reinventar a criação artística para que ela possa ser de facto mais sustentável, sem prejuízo de pôr em causa completamente a liberdade e uma liberdade muito necessária para a criação artística.
No fundo, não queríamos que o pensamento sobre a sustentabilidade custasse a nossa própria atividade profissional, porque de facto, se levarmos isto ao extremo, se calhar devíamos todos parar de criar. E não é isso que nós queremos fazer,
Claro.
não é? Que queremos continuar a poder criar, temos que tomar consciência e ganhar conhecimento daquilo que é a nossa pegada e dos impactos que produzimos, isso é o primeiro passo, e temos que fazer esse esforço realmente, mas não podemos prescindir do nosso espaço de liberdade para continuar a criar.
Mas sabemos que, e no caso da formiga que vive da circulação de espetáculos, sabemos que a pegada da circulação é muito mais impactante e sentimos que é aí que pode haver de facto uma grande diferença. O facto de estarmos sediados em Portugal, enfim, traz-nos, enquanto companhia, bastantes desafios. O facto de ser um país muito periférico, que está na ponta da Europa.
O facto de termos uma escala muito pequena e, por exemplo, disso representar em termos de organização de turnês nacionais uma dificuldade muito grande, porque praticamente todos os territórios geograficamente contíguos são concorrentes entre si, ou seja, disputam os mesmos públicos e, portanto, não querem apresentações em datas próximas, dificultam o pensamento sobre a racionalidade dos recursos utilizados nas digressões nacionais.
O facto de termos uma rede ferroviária diminuta e muito antiga faz com que seja muito difícil não recorrer nacional, em termos nacionais, não recorrer, por exemplo, ao carro para fazer a circulação e não recorrer também ao avião quando se trata de circulação internacional, porque a rede ferroviária portuguesa não está de toda integrada com as redes ferroviárias europeias.
Isso tem também a ver com a ideia de rentabilização do próprio tempo, ou seja, enquanto nós não conseguirmos pensar no tempo de uma outra forma e tivermos de tirar partido do tempo, nada vai bater a deslocação que for mais rápida e mais eficaz de um ponto A para o ponto B. Aquilo que nós sentimos que pode ser e deve ser a ajuda e não a penalização às companhias, deve ser precisamente o sentido de disponibilizar informação e apoio para que as companhias, nas suas saídas internacionais, possam organizar pequenas turnês que possam ter esse apoio das entidades nacionais e europeias para entrarem em contacto com teatros, programadores, espaços de apresentação que sejam contíguos a locais que já estão contratualizados pelas companhias, as suas deslocações.
Uma única deslocação de avião impactante possa render, em vez de uma única apresentação num único local, possa render 5 ou 6 apresentações em 5 ou 6 locais diferentes. E isso é, de facto, uma força numa ideia de sustentabilidade.
Creio que o Programa Europa Criativa deverá valorizar as estratégias de sustentabilidade nos projetos a apoiar atual e futuramente. Com a experiência do último ano, é hoje viável e eficaz o recurso ao ambiente digital em distintos domínios da nossa atividade, num contexto de cooperação, num projeto internacional e da experiência pessoal enquanto entidade líder do Beta Circus, todo o contexto de planeamento e gestão está a realizar-se de forma digital. Creio que este prisma deverá ser valorizado para o futuro como prática sustentável e mesmo facilitadora da cooperação internacional, com efeitos profissionais e também na vida pessoal dos envolvidos. Por outro lado, não imagino as artes performativas sem o contexto ao vivo. A pandemia provou-nos que é possível realizar reuniões produtivas sem os intervenientes estarem presencialmente na mesma sala. E ainda que é possível ativar ferramentas de gestão através de sistemas de partilha online com maximização da eficácia e da produtividade. Diria ainda que a pandemia ajudou o setor a melhorar o registro dos espetáculos ao vivo, que certamente poderá responder a um problema antigo: a memória e o arquivo nas artes performativas.
Cortar emissões de carbono, cortando na circulação das artes vivas, é a forma mais certeira de aumentar as emissões de carbono na Europa a médio prazo. Um país fechado sobre si próprio, que só conhece a sua própria cultura e onde as trocas culturais com o exterior são diminutas, é terreno fértil para o crescimento de partidos nacionalistas de extrema-direita, que sabemos serem os grandes negacionistas das alterações climáticas. Basta lembrarmos-nos que nos últimos 4 anos os Estados Unidos tiveram um presidente de extrema-direita com políticas ambientais desastrosas que fizeram o mundo perder tempo precioso no progresso para economias mais verdes. Um país fechado sobre si próprio era o que era Portugal até 1974, uma ditadura fascista e colonialista que dizia de si própria estar orgulhosamente só. Eu sou uma bailarina e coreógrafa de uma geração que surgiu quando o país se abriu à cultura e às artes vindas de outros países e latitudes. Sou resultado da troca direta que me foi proporcionada enquanto público com artistas e propostas que me abriram horizontes, não só artísticos como sociais e culturais. As artes vivas baseiam-se na presença e a pandemia permitiu-nos a todos entender o efeito único e a profunda importância que a presença viva dos outros tem na nossa existência. Não são fenómenos que possam acontecer por Zoom ou por Skype. A circulação de arte e artistas no espaço europeu não é por isso só uma questão de proporcionar trabalho aos artistas, é uma questão com um alcance social e cultural mais profundo e alargado. O que tem sido até hoje o programa Erasmus, dito de uma forma simples, um programa para cortar nas emissões do ódio. O consumo da produção local faz todo o sentido em relação à alimentação. Infelizmente, o mesmo não se aplica em relação à arte e à cultura. A poupança carbónica na circulação nas artes valerá o custo de uma Europa mais vulnerável aos nacionalismos extremistas? Temos que olhar para o quadro maior que toda esta questão implica. Não podemos fazer o papel de bons alunos no corte de emissões carbónicas em políticas que serão meramente de fachada. Temos que exigir políticas climáticas verdadeiramente consequentes nos setores em que essas políticas são realmente determinantes. Quais são os emissores carbónicos de topo na Europa? Estudos mostram que o primeiro e mais importante emissor carbónico em todo o espaço europeu é uma central a carvão. O segundo é também uma central a carvão. O terceiro também. E o quarto, o quinto, o sexto e todos, até ao 9º mais importante emissor carbónico europeu, são centrais a carvão. Esta é a questão mais prioritária de que se devia estar a falar todos os dias. O 10º maior emissor carbónico europeu são todos os voos da Ryanair durante um ano. Mas dessa enorme fatia emissora que é a Ryanair, quanto corresponde a artistas das artes performativas em circulação e quanto corresponde a turismo de massas? Se aplicarmos cortes na possibilidade de circulação das artes vivas sem fazermos nenhum trabalho a nível do problema do turismo de massas, as companhias aéreas continuarão a voar livremente a preços baixíssimos, sem pagarem impostos, lançando todo o carbono que quiserem para a atmosfera, mas eu não vou poder ver no meu país aquilo que é feito, por exemplo, por artistas polacos ou alemães, que estão talvez a fazer peças sobre como acabar com as dezenas de centrais a carvão dos seus respectivos países, onde elas são as mais numerosas. Chama-se isto um verdadeiro e rotundo absurdo europeu. Sugiro que a cultura trabalhe para o corte no carvão e no turismo de massas. Sugiro que se coloque o problema das centrais a carvão no centro da agenda cultural europeia e que se faça o mesmo com o problema do turismo de massas. Sugiro também que os ministros da Cultura unam forças com os ministros do Ambiente, da Ciência e com a sociedade civil, para chegarem aos seus conselhos de ministros com força suficiente para exigir cortes de emissões nas áreas onde estes são realmente efetivos e que desse modo criem espaço para que a cultura possa continuar a cumprir o seu papel fundamental no espaço europeu. Por último, mas não menos importante, em Portugal os despachos que estipularam o estado de emergência e o estado de calamidade na pandemia estão repletos de exceções para a circulação de desportistas, mas não se encontra neles nenhuma exceção para a circulação de artistas. Espetáculos em festivais de teatro foram cancelados porque artistas vindos de França com testes negativos teriam mesmo assim que entrar em quarentena. No entanto, atletas vindos da mesma França puderam entrar e participar em provas de motocross, judo, handball e outras, porque se enquadravam nas referidas exceções. As leis criadas em tempo de pandemia protegeram a circulação de atletas, mas não protegeram a circulação de artistas. Isto diz tudo em relação às prioridades de um governo no presente e no futuro, em pandemias virais ou carbónicas. a não ser que artistas, agentes culturais e ministérios da cultura lutem com todas as suas forças para que a Europa cultural não desapareça.
Olá a todos, aqui da Ilha de São Miguel, nos Açores. Falar a partir daqui obriga-nos constantemente a pensar nas relações entre centro e periferia e de como este sistema económico, político e social continua a ocupar, a impor-se e a perpetuar essas relações de poder e de domínio entre territórios de forma extrativa e desigual. Quando falamos de sustentabilidade e na sua tradução e impacto nas questões sociais e, claro, ecológicas, é importante pensarmos a relação que temos com o outro. É fundamental encontrar uma centrifuria que reconheça a interdependência e a simultaneidade dos territórios. Este conceito poderá ser chave para originar uma ação conjunta que acontece em simultâneo, por relação, mas que também seja capaz de se adaptar e gerar autonomia. Aliás, a autonomia é uma palavra importante quando falamos dos Açores, onde as questões da acessibilidade e circulação se cruzam com aquelas do processo autonómico. E não são apenas as ilhas que estão dependentes dessa mobilidade, até porque há muitas margens no continente europeu e outras tantas dentro do sistema artístico contemporâneo. Deixo-vos a preocupação periférica de não sermos invisibilizados ou excluídos desse debate, onde cada território é essencial para a construção de uma solução que no final deve ser comum e conjunta. Há que reconhecer que os contextos centrais, mais ricos e privilegiados, terão outra capacidade de resposta ao desafio ecológico, porque já têm acesso a mecanismos, a infraestruturas e a financiamentos para tal. E ao mesmo tempo entender que contextos periféricos ou ultraperiféricos, como os Açores, têm outros constrangimentos económicos e geográficos que não lhes permite ter essa resposta tão imediata ou direta. Mas que isso não quer dizer que não tenham ideias ou propostas. O que me parece então importante é pensarmos como podemos introduzir práticas mais responsáveis na forma como nos movemos e nos recursos que utilizamos nos contextos de programação e criação artística e que devem ser acompanhadas de ações complementares que mitiguem esses impactos sem comprometer fluxos e que sejam empáticas com a condição do outro, periférico.
Eu sou Dori Nigro, sou pedagogo e artista. Há 8 anos vivo em Portugal. Nasci numa zona periférica do Nordeste brasileiro, na qual os problemas ambientais de hoje refletem um passado que invadiu, colonizou e soterrou as vidas e a natureza. Sou neto de Elizabeth, uma trabalhadora modesta da zona rural, que vivia da plantação e da pesca. Minha avó plantou uma mangueira que não mais existe. Foi derrubada por enchentes ancestrais. Lembro-me das mangas doces que brotavam daquela árvore. Depois do falecimento de minha avó, a árvore tornou-se para mim uma extensão dela. Ao conversar com a árvore era como se falasse também com a minha avó. Debaixo da árvore fazíamos performances, mesmo sem saber que o era, e ensaiávamos com um grupo de teatro amador da comunidade. Aquela árvore testemunhou desde cedo meu interesse pela arte, e fez-me alçar novos voos, descer pontes e fazer travessias. Atravessei mares. Cheguei em Portugal através de uma mobilidade conseguida pelo meu companheiro. Uma mobilidade conseguida através de políticas públicas, no qual uma bolsa de estudo foi partilhada por 2 pessoas. No entanto, tenho a consciência de que nem todas as pessoas têm esse privilégio. Há artistas que não conseguem viver de suas artes. Há artistas que não conseguem levar seus trabalhos ao estrangeiro. A situação torna-se ainda mais difícil quando pensamos no recorte da raça, classe e do gênero. Falar então em sustentabilidade ambiental é falar em sustentabilidade da vida humana. Sustentabilidade requer um processo que deve permitir a gestão da vida a longo prazo. No entanto, enquanto houver vidas brutalizadas, negadas e excluídas, como pensar um futuro sustentável? Sustentável para quem? Quando vim estudar na Faculdade de Belas Artes da Universidade do Porto, Não encontrei um professor ou professora negra. Eu era um dos poucos alunos negros daquela escola, vivendo nesta triste exceção. Que futuro sustentável haverá enquanto vivermos um presente que repete modelos de colonialidades? Que futuro sustentável esperar enquanto houver zero ou quase nenhuma pluralidade nos espaços de criação e decisão? Cabe-nos pensar na qualidade de vida de artistas que vivem nas margens, artistas que não têm o privilégio de receber apoios, nem tampouco de fazer mobilidade. Creio que para avançarmos para o tema da sustentabilidade ambiental, é necessário pensar em reparações e enfrentamento das desigualdades raciais, sociais e culturais, bem como o enfrentamento do problema do racismo institucional e estrutural. É mais do que urgente cuidarmos do meio ambiente, criar políticas públicas e estratégias sustentáveis. Não há mais como fugir ou negar dessa realidade. Sem mais, agradeço a atenção.
Neste último segmento, vou conversar com Américo Rodrigues, diretor-geral das Artes, e Cristina Farinha, perita em questões de mobilidade artística, a quem dou as boas-vindas.
Now the time has come for me to have a chat with Américo Rodrigues, Director General for the Arts, and Cristina Farinha, expert in arts mobility, to whom I bid a very warm welcome. I thank both of you for being here with me today, and allow me to share with you some of my feelings downstream from what the video pics we just saw. One of the very first things I read therein is that one cannot ignore the political overtones of this topic, and if one does so, will hardly bring about sustainable changes that cultural agents will identify with. In actual fact, whether we are asked or we ask of ourselves to do something for the environment from the deprived sector of arts and culture is the most violent of contradictions. Under pressure as European art workers from the green transition agenda, we could counter-argue that environmental issues are mainly world governance issues, or issues that China, Russia or India have got to solve. And we would not be amiss in so saying. Somebody presented yesterday a slide that said something like small actions plus a great many people equals great changes. But to discuss environmental sustainability in the arts is also, for me and many of us, tantamount to maintaining a frowning brow. The neoliberal capitalism is want to put the emphasis on individual behaviors while it amplifies enormously systemic problems. To discuss environmental sustainability in the arts is tantamount to being available for a radical honesty exercise. The ecological footprint of arts practices is neglectable when juxtaposed to large-scale polluting industrial activities, or like any other human activity, should it do its bit, however small. To discuss environmental sustainability in the arts is tantamount to acknowledging the lack of comfort in this dual criteria and the gigantic contradiction under which we operate as professionals of waste, as Inês Barahona and Miguel Fragata said. As we saw, there are artists and other arts professionals who want to come up with ways and means of progressively adapting their practices to environmental requirements, be it in the type of energy they use to move about, or the more rational organization of their international tours. We have to find ways of supporting them in this endeavor. But some also share more complex difficulties, such as the compressed time under which they work and which forces them to opt for rapid means of transport, or the fragility of their working conditions. The famous and very pertinent exchange between the Belgium director Jérôme Bale and the Mexican artist Lázaro Rodrigues lives on. The Belgian artist stating that he will travel no more, and the Mexican artist responding that from his point of view things are not that easy. The realities of hypermobility of some and the forced mobility of others are less linear than they seem, and to support the environmental cause is something which is social, politically and economically under conditions. From Portugal and across Europe to ponder on environmental issues in interfacing with transnational mobility practices is also, or should be, to face up to the meek colonial ox, in borrowing words from a poet, always far outstripping ours. Those of us who've followed the proceedings of yesterday's sitting of this conference will have understood that there are discrepancies among sectors between AV and performing arts, for instance. In the case of AV, it's already under discussion and even testing carbon measurement tools in production movies. The very media program has to find ways and means of intervening in accelerating the embodiment of environmental challenges in the AV industry. As yesterday Sylvia Gatta or Suzanne Nikolchev very rightly said, it's crucial for the legislative fine-tuning to be supported in a dialogue with field workers, and despite, however urgent, it may also be prudent to start with incentivizing more than with selecting, and I'll be listening to both of you on this. This is a good point in time in which to take in hand our international cooperation and mobility practices. It's a good point in time, not just because the new Creative Europe program is being launched, but also in light of all the other financing mechanisms that will be available after the pandemic. It is because of this relative late coming that we believed it to be important, more than presenting another environmental tool applied to performing arts, to acquire political and strategic clarity that may support thereafter practical and technical decisions that seem to be inevitable. Allow me, therefore, to call you to the screen Cristina and Américo, with whom I will be briefly conversing. I hope they're there. I think so. Yes, they are. Not just of the videos, but also of the kind sharing by colleagues of their thoughts. Allow me, Américo, to start by asking you, what kind of feeling did the videos prompt in you, but also inevitably, in light of their contents, how in a country, and obviously not just Portugal, a great many other European member states are still coming to terms with very tough but very basic difficulties in this regard. So how, from a body such as Director General for Arts, can we deal with these fundamental contradictions? Very good morning. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I was most impressed with the quality and diversity of the testimony we just heard, as well as the irony permeating most, together with the poignant nature of their true concerns. Artists and cultural managers alike. We could, of course, stay here forevermore discussing what they said. A great many topics were touched upon, worthy of in-depth exchanges, and DG Arts fully intends to do so. Therefore, first and foremost, a very warm word of thanks to them. As to the apparent contradiction of a state body devoted to the support of the arts to worry about these issues, I beg to differ. I don't see any contradiction therein, quite the opposite. DG Arts and its sister or their sister organizations across Europe are called upon to support artists and arts, and therefore must make themselves available to exchange, to discuss, in some cases to lead, in any case to walk the walk, together with those committed to perfecting what's not well, not just in Portugal, but elsewhere in Europe. We've been fighting for years against prerequisites, namely in connection with the very dignity of artists. Allow me to remind you that yesterday we concluded public discussion of the professional status of culture professionals, which we hope will be improved and fine-tuned, and in any case will be a novelty insofar as no such thing existed. And on the other, in the week prior to that, we heard of the setting up of the national network of theatres and contemporaneous art. In my humble view, obviously not an exempt one, we are undergoing a time of change in Portugal. As some of the artists we heard said, and rightly so, culture is a very fragile sector in Portugal, has been down the years. We therefore must tackle structural issues as opposed to merely cosmetic interventions. And we can only do so with the artists themselves. Therefore, DG Arts fully intends to do so with them. Of course, we do not believe that we'll be able overnight to solve all of these issues. If for no other reason, because a great many of them are of a macro nature, and their complexity far outstrips the possibilities DG Arts has to act. But what I can tell you is that we will be joining hands with artists and their representative bodies, namely through cultural funding, to do our bit in furthering the solution to all of these issues. Therefore, in a nutshell, I see no contradiction in having DG Arts meeting one of its noblest remits, namely to support artists in Portugal. So more of an additional responsibility than a contradiction. Indeed so. You referred to mapping. My question to Cristina Farinha hinges precisely on that. Until the end of 22, we'll be living through a point in time where the EU will engage into a ginormous review and legislative production stage, within which dozens of directives and regulations will have to be negotiated and approved, aiming at meeting the carbon neutrality and emission target figures. It is a highly complex set of topics that hinge on topics that are highly sensitive when it comes to carbon markets and international competition rules, and nobody in the arts field can be required to fully master these fields. Two questions. Do we have enough information, and what attitudes should be adopted by public policies? Following and implementing, or rather anticipating and leading. Thank you very much. We have indeed a great deal to do in the sector when it comes to technology. The sector has been experimenting for a number of years in this connection, also partially with the support of Creative Europe. Testing new production practices, fostering in-house changes within the sector and society. Despite such experiments, these tools and this know-how is not within the grasp of most professionals or organizations. But only a few of them will be able to have access thereto, let alone put them to good use. The awareness of practice changing is increasing, but the how-to is still under a heavy cloud, and in most countries guidance is sorely lacking. Hence, how crucial we see to support professionals in having access to all of this, sharing good practices. And here there's an important role to be played by national, regional, local public policy, but also at European Union level on a basis of complementarity. Platforms such as Perform Europe, the several networks and entities representing the sector can and should get involved therein. But also from the point of view of academia, when it comes to diagnosing and studying not just reality but ways to change it, we have to regulate and to move forward with policies and programs of a more greener nature, as you said. But of course we have to study fair metrics in light of all the different interests and contexts. Within Creative Europe, this very year, a study will be launched focusing on how to foster the green nature of the very program and how to involve potential beneficiaries in espousing these goals at the level of the very drafting of their projects. Other than how, we of course must continue to look into manners for the sector to incorporate these values into its MO. What impacts will they bring about at the level of the public experiments underway, etc., etc. And finally, other than researching, we have to keep assessing and monitoring continuously and developments underway with a view to safeguarding a fair and balanced sharing of all of this across the territory and the sector. Americo, regarding this question, and particularly in light of the upcoming legislative procedures, one final political question as follows. Insofar as policies that may be adopted in this regard are external to culture, environmental, economic, and regional, if not global in scope, how do you believe should public cultural policies adapt to this fact? Should they wait and see, or should they anticipate and lead? As I see them, they should lead, very much so. I believe that it makes all kinds of sense to have culture at the forefront of this effort, promoting articulation with other ministries in defining concerted policies. But culture has a decisive role to play in this regard, namely building bridges to other sectors. And this is very much underway. It's part and parcel of the political agenda being discussed. Now's the time to start producing documents and draft legislation. Within the field of the Ministry of Culture, this is very much part of what's on the table, as it were. We, as Cristina Farinha said, we must tackle a great many topics in one fell swoop, but culture must always be at the very center of that discussion, i.e. To consider all of these issues from a place of culture. I'm afraid we don't have much time left. Allow me to go back to you, Cristina, and to ask you, anticipating on what Creative Europe may do in connection with all of this, could we have your contribution regarding the actual stands to be adopted by a program such as Creative Europe? We've had contributions as to what it actually means to have a program that gives value, that attaches relevance to the central place to be played by culture. It's all about how to promote the adoption of new practices through the program across the sector in a fair manner. First and foremost, competitiveness is very much of the essence, despite its environmental impact. It's crucial for the European project and for the interests of all professionals. The program continues to give pride of place to creation, circulation, international exchange, including outside the boundaries of the European Union. We are coming to the end of a European pilot project. A new scheme is about to be launched for individual mobility. How to continue to support mobility in a more sustainable manner. Secondly, working conditions for artists, fair pay, freedom of expression, all of this is very much part of the agenda across Europe and will have pride of place in the new Cultural Agenda 20 for the upcoming period. Those who benefit from public policies in favor of culture are in a better position to change and try out new practices. Social issues must be kept in mind when pondering on how best to have financing models mirroring environmental concerns. Creative Europe program has a great deal of work ahead of it when it comes to the European Green Deal, also in the context of other cross-cutting issues such as gender equality, sustainability, etc., adopting the promotion of new practices, and also through arts and culture to promote awareness of these issues. It is of course required to propose concrete incentives to provide means to those who want to experiment. But I would say supplementary, added means that must be made available vis-à-vis the investment that was already underway. And we have to further be aware that in giving pride of place to those who will be involved, we will be putting a penalty on those who are not, because that may determine whether one is going to be funded or not. It is therefore also crucial to look into how to continue to take into account of peripheral minor projects. One size does not fit all. The different initiatives already announced by media very much go to this goal. Creative Europe will be investing in research. The program will continue to support empowerment and dissemination of knowledge. Baby steps perhaps, but fortunately so, I think, because it mirrors the challenges of the sector and of the artists that would not live happily with radical challenges, despite the doubling of our funding, on which we all congratulate ourselves. We are still the litter vis-à-vis other European programs. And investment is crucial, calling for new HR, more intermediary, more technical resources. Creative Europe and its programs will be investing along these lines, hopefully in a fairer and productive manner. Of course, we are not the only kids on the block. Other programs exist, and the environmental issue is very much a case in point. We must continue to pay heed to the new European Bauhaus movement, with a view to involving and culturally translating the Green Deal. The three pillars of aesthetics, sustainability and inclusion are, I hope not being too optimistic, a green sign coming from the Commission. In conclusion, says the Speaker, we must have dialogue and coordination amongst member states at the level of ministries of culture, DG Arts, and their sister organizations, together with ongoing discussion on financing models. Creative Europe cannot replace that contribution. We can but contribute thereto. Territorial cohesion also is present from the point of view of arts and culture. Thank you very much, Christina. We're all taking copious notes. We all know that it's a difficult thing to make structured contributions to such a short panel. Something I believe still requires one final question going to Meriku in connection with scarcity of resources, particularly in the light of supplementary ambitions that keep being piled on to existing ones. Complementarity must be very much part of the picture. Erasmus always is seen as the jewel in the European crown. And it's very clear today that Erasmus is the success story we all acknowledge, because it is complemented from several different sides, namely school support, scholarships, etc. We're all aware of the ambiguous or the ambiguity that may permeate the incorporation of these concerns in trying to avoid turning it into an obstacle. We had agreed to not forget the world outside Europe, if only briefly. Also because this conference cannot be seen divorced from European history and geography, and the role they played in the exploration of the seas and the worlds beyond the seas. How, therefore, can we, from the point of view of ensuring market outreach of European artists, live up to continuing to do it in full respect of the concerns that were put forward by the different videos? What about digital means of building bridges over the ocean? Both national and international bodies want to ponder on this and contribute thereto.
DG Arts wants to develop the mobility of artists, increase their ability to move around. We want to find ways of doing this. We have to also consider how to do this with, and at the same time reduce environmental impacts. So, in other words, we need to encourage the mobility of artists. Now, we are also supporting the Creative Europe program, but we also have an internationalization program, and we joined two important Ibero-American networks, Ibersena and Ibermusicas. We joined these networks a short time ago. One of them is in the field of the performing arts, the other's music, as the title indicates. This allowed Portuguese artists to obtain more support, to be seen. We're not just talking about creating shows, performances, we're talking about residencies, study programs. So more possibilities for artists in Latin America. That too is one of the ways in which we are contributing to the movement of Portuguese artists, and this, as I said, has been supported by the DG for the Arts. Vanya, you referred to the historic element, Portugal's positioning in the world, and of course we need to reach out to Portuguese-speaking countries because of that. We are trying to build bridges between the PALOPs, the Portuguese language speaking countries of Africa and the American continent. This too helps encourage movement of Portuguese artists abroad. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure we could say a lot more about this particular complex topic. It's also an interesting conversation because I guess we have to understand how far a national body can go in terms of its mandate. Well, one of our missions at the DG for Arts is to contribute to the internationalization of Portuguese artists and art. That is clearly stated in our mission statement. We also represent Portugal formally in certain fora. That is part and parcel, as I said, of the mission statement of the DG for the Arts. It was a political decision made by the Ministry of Culture and by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. They decided that the DG for Arts would be given this role. Well then, going back to the European dimension, to the European sphere, we're constantly moving between two different levels. But Christina, we know that the new Creative Europe program has brought about significant changes, progress in terms of what we call third countries. I'm not sure that's the best way of referring to them, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But tell me how you see this progress under Creative Europe. Tell me what further can be done, what needs to be coordinated at that level. Well, post-pandemic, we need to strengthen already existing ties, cultural ties, ties promoting diversity, but also economic ties with other continents, freedom, artistic freedom, freedom of expression are connected with this planetary dimension. So we do need to strengthen this international dimension, be able to operate internationally, supporting platforms and networks that are fundamental in facilitating these ties. And later, we hope that we will be able to improve support to international partnerships and cooperation projects. Of course, we have an agenda for culture, which began in 2018, but we also have an agenda for cultural exchanges with other countries. The 2030 agenda of the United Nations, of course, doesn't explicitly refer to culture, but of course, the Sustainable Development Goals also constitute an umbrella for culture. Cultural operators and institutions understand that there are inequalities, power relations that are historical in nature, that are reproduced socially, economically, culturally over time. Some have been heightened by the pandemic. We woke up to what the promise of globalization was all about. And now the debate focuses on how to develop mutual interaction, mutual exchange and understanding, so fairer collaboration. We need to think about the mobility flows, a lot of which are unequal, imbalanced. We also need to consider the interdependence of territories. If we make environmental issues worse, we're going to make social issues work. They're all interlinked. There are social issues, racism, gender-based issues. All of these are also part and parcel of the agenda. There are obstacles as well, physical barriers, social barriers. There is no panacea here. We know that there is a lot of inequality in access, in the ability for people to participate and participate even in the contents themselves. There is great complexity in competition, and considerations need to be made also with regards to cultural diversity. So we need more responsible praxis, lato sensu, together with additional measures to mitigate the effects thereof, always taking the other into account. In its external action programs and in its ambitions at a cultural level, the EU must consider supporting a number of elements, and I will list a few. Promoting learning among peers, empowering people to more just internationalization, digitalization, mutual exchange and learning, coordination of tours. We need to make sure that we reach out to the communities, to the different audiences, not forgetting that works and circulation require a context to be considered. There are long-term efforts that are required. We need to invest in more long-term sustainable processes. Think about the beneficiaries. Think about the professionals, the intermediaries, who are also fundamental at this level. Information centers, the so-called desks under the Creative Europe program. There are already a number of ties with the Portuguese-speaking countries, but we need to enhance those further. And let's not forget other European operators. European delegations can also help identify partners. And let's not forget the role of the platforms and networks that can facilitate all of these interactions. I think we need a whole conference for all of this, says the speaker. Oh, I'm sure we would need a full conference to be dedicated to these matters. I do believe we need to be optimistic, however. There's a lot to be done, it is true, but that should encourage us and not paralyze us. Of course, it is clear that there are many, many concerns and lists that need to be made of things that we want to do. We can't cover everything in 90 minutes. The 90 minutes have flown by, I have to say. And I would perhaps ask Americo to please, very quickly, in reaction to this large list of things to do, the need for tools that will help us measure, training, capacity building programs, support desks, intermediaries. What do you think we should do? How do we begin? Where do we begin? How does a body such as yours in a member state begin? And what are the next steps required? So what do you begin with when you look at that list? Well, I think this conversation has to continue. I think that's apparent. Christina has left many different ideas for future debate. We will need another forum, evidently. And she's invited us to reflect on a number of different topics. And then for a body such as ours at DG for the Arts, of course, we do need to look at these matters as a matter of priority. We already have a number of concerns reflected in open calls for dialogue with artists. And we are also focusing on additional supports and incentive to artists so they can deal with these challenges. And we must share best practice. I mean, these are just a few of the ideas that come to mind very quickly. I know we've run out of time, but let's proceed with this conversation. That's the idea I would leave before all of you. I think this is a stimulating and urgent challenge. Thank you very much. I think it would be possible to draw up a large action plan. I've taken note of all of the different points raised, so it will all be recorded. I'll go back to this. We need to go back to all of this and then take up the debate again. I will now conclude this panel. Thank you to the DG for the Arts for having extended this invitation to me. Thank you to all the different partners, the Information Center, Creative Europe Portugal. Thank you all for collaborating with us also through the videos.